Good evening, everyone. It's just shortly after 7, so I think it's a good time to get started so that we can give Georgia enough time to speak and for you guys to ask questions after the fact before the reception. Okay. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Musqueam land. I'd like to thank the Musqueam Band for allowing us to use their land. Just a brief thing. My name is Nicola Hayward. I am the conference director this year, while Laura is on sabbatical. She'll be back next year for everyone. So our keynote speaker today is Georgia. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today at VST's 2024 conference, Sacred Arts in a Pluralistic Society. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Georgia Angelopoulos. Georgia is a renowned calligrapher and illuminator, having studied under eminent calligraphers such as Dennis Brown, Martin Jackson, and Peter Thornton. She has also studied under Sue Houghton, who worked on the St. John's Bible, which is one of 299 editions, now housed in the Center of Studies of Religion and Society at the University of Victoria. Georgia is here to speak to us today about the practice of ancient writing and illumination and its relevance for sacred art. Her work is deeply influenced by historical manuscripts, ancient techniques, and her Greek heritage. Her work has appeared in the World Encyclopedia of Calligraphy, Letters and Arts, and Bound and Lettered. Georgia has worked for the government inscribing oaths for incoming members of parliament, as well as documents to be signed by heads of state. Her religious works include the Orphic Prayers, Song of Songs, and the Christian journal Weaving. Thank you, Georgia, for accepting our keynote invitation today at VST, and we are looking forward to your this presentation this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a real honor and pleasure to be here with you sharing this vocation I care for very deeply, just slightly unusual vocation for the 21st century, being a calligrapher and illuminator. And thank you all for coming and for those who facilitated this presentation, and especially to Nicola, who invited me and braved both my inexperience and my less than stellar computer technology skills. Part of tonight's presentation reflect my experiences and research as artist in residence at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at UVic this year. This is where I met Nicola as I was giving a short presentation for members of the center about my practice of the arts of calligraphy and illumination. And this experience afforded me the time to make art of my choosing and to research the history of writing with an emphasis on Greek, as well as reflect on my own art practices and writing itself as a subject in the context of the times we live in. The following images, I'll get this right. Oh, there we go. These following images sort of illustrate the kind of everyday work I do, all ranging from documents to wedding invitations to panels for donors and churches, and just private commissions for poetry that's meaningful to people. Now, at the center, I was deeply touched by the sincere concerns, thoughts, and ideas expressed in our daily conversations about our world and how we live in it, and how we might somehow act to improve rather than harm, and find the best ways to collectively counter the chaos we have so close around us in the world. It was both humbling and inspiring, sitting beside scholars from so many diverse disciplines, and this reminded me that connecting the seemingly diverse is fruitful, if not critical, for communication, understanding, and tolerance. In the world of the arts, this concept is called creating harmony. Through these interactions, I was compelled to ask and attempt to answer questions with an increased sense of responsibility, such as, how can I, as an artist, be of service to my community? And how can art best serve our needs in the 21st century? And is it essential to our well-being? I know bright lights such as William Morris and countless others before him would answer that with a resounding yes, and link art to the concept of beauty, that is natural beauty or nature, which is also vital to us and which is us, and which is increasingly becoming a central theme in my work and understanding of the spiritual and the sacred. My original topic was twofold: to study ancient Greek, early Christian, and Byzantine writing practices, and reflect also on contemporary activities around writing, hoping to find lines of continuity to the present. I was also looking to challenge the often repeated assertion that Western writing, that's Greek and Latin or Roman, was born of the needs of commerce and trade and has little or no mystical cachet, like some other world scripts. So, and what I mean by this is not just sacred content that is written, but the way things are written. I purposefully characterized writing practices as technologies, leaning on the definition, the Greek definition leaning on the definition of the Greek word for art, which is techni, and which furnishes the word technology. It's of Proto-Indo-European origin and offers a broad and inclusive understanding of art, craft, craftsmanship, art, artfulness, workmanship, trade, skill, and wherewithal. Apart from persistent curiosity, the impetus behind these topics is essentially connection to a culture I did not grow up in, but grew up with, and which significantly shaped my values and worldview. This Greek heritage was explained to me as identity, as some kind of passport for existence. And connection is key because it generates a sense of belonging. And for me, that means straddling two very different worlds and finding meaning and commonalities in both. Writing is one of the ways we communicate and connect, so it seemed a good place to start. Also, chasing the sacred seems to be a lifelong obsession, and it's taken me down many paths. So the tools and materials I've set out tonight, which I hope you all have a chance to come and look at, prove a really deep connection to nature and the scribe. Each surface is a world of its own, unique, made from the fibers of plants such as papyrus, linen, cotton, and abaca. And there's also parchment, the skin of various animals such as sheep, cows, and goats, that was used resourcefully and responsibly in the scribal tradition. Gold is especially important in illumination. It glows like the sun, it does not tarnish or fade, and it often indicates the presence of the divine, something holy, something special. And the tools themselves, the reed pens invented by the Greeks, set the look of the letters we use today. The goose and the wild turkey quills have an organic feel and warmth. Donald Jackson, who is the head scribe of the St. John's Bible, describes the quill as the closest tool resembling us, made as the same stuff as our nails. The quill acts as an extension of the hand and can best transmit our energy onto the page. Calligraphers still use them, and I have two little quills up here that were cut by Sue Houghton, who worked on the St. John's Bible. She cut them for me. So I hope you have a chance to look at them. And then there are the earth pigments used since people started painting in caves. And you could say that these tools and materials were all quite sacred, and that the peoples who wrote on these materials thought so too. I've been studying the ancient tetrachrome palette, which is a very simple palette of white, yellow, red earth, and black. And astonishingly, how much could be made with those four colors. Each of those four colors are loaded with symbolism and always have been, and they're still used the same way by artists and also by Aboriginal artists. Immersing myself in the origins of these traditions is enriching and gives the practice more depth and understanding. These are all slow arts, and that is what makes them especially pleasurable and probably almost necessary in these times of so much distraction. I have the good fortune to have been taught how to write by teachers with real missionary zeal. And even back then, just as now, handwriting was not the only conceivable writing technology, yet I doubt that any of those teachers could imagine a time when learning how to form letters by hand could possibly be rendered superfluous. I remember talk of the character of the individual being expressed in handwriting, the importance of the direct human touch, of recognizing the individual hand of a person. And it all implied a far more intimate connection than typing on a typewriter, which I also enjoy, but in a very different way. Not to mention that writing by hand, as opposed to typing or tapping, activates the brain in different ways. We tend to retain more when we write by hand. We've long juggled several types of communication technologies, and it could be argued that abandoning conventional writing altogether might be a measure of cultural poverty, lack of foresight, or blind belief in the supremacy of the digital world. Digital technologies are superseded quickly, but writing technologies should be as diverse as possible, should be safeguarded and built to be as flexible and strong as cultural foundation. It's odd that the fact that a Mesopotamian clay tablet inscribed with wedged cuneiform writing 4,000 years ago might actually outlive all our sophisticated technologies. So why is writing vital, and how do we think of writing as art? I hope this short presentation tonight addresses some of these notions and goes a small way towards the re-enchantment of this precious cultural inheritance. Because calligraphy and illumination are niche subjects, I'd like to briefly illustrate how letter design and calligraphy are still woven into the everyday. Technically, for the most part, calligraphers became redundant about 5 centuries ago with the invention of the printing press. But here I am, and there are thousands of us around the world who still find everything about letters and writing a fascinating and rich field. So these two images are 2,500 years apart, and they're remarkably similar. Many of you may know Steve Jobs. I think everybody here probably does. And the two images, one is of an ancient Greek scribe from a rendering I did off a pot. And I lucked out and found these wax tablets often opened horizontally, but I found one that opened vertically in the exact same way a laptop does. And many people don't know about Steve's important connection to the way we see letters today. And the story goes that while he was at Reed College, he was floundering and felt he was wasting his parents' money doing so. So he audited calligraphy and lettering classes taught by a Trappist monk named Robert Palladino. Now, all of the teachers in that particular area were very esoteric and spiritual, and he picked up on this as well. The classes, the reason we have so many good fonts is because of his study of Roman book scripts, which gave him a grounding in what constitutes solid, well-made letter forms, which are the basis or the heartwood for type. Calligraphy is really the heartwood of type. They spread with empire, colonization, and Christianity. And this knowledge underpinned Adobe's success. World-class calligraphers created excellent digital fonts for this nascent technology. And they designed for ever-changing technologies and even helping with neurodiversity. For example, some typefaces are designed to help people with dyslexia. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but it's in an endeavor to aid literacy for all. A word here also on how these two images attest in their own way the democratization of writing. Writing in most other cultures, and certainly before Greek culture developed, was the reserve of the elite and the specially trained. In Greece, more people could write than ever. Not all, but it was a more accessible technology. And one more word, if I may, and that is to point out the very clear connection of writing to the other arts. And you can see just a little bit of an ancient lyre on the side. Music and writing were intimately linked in the Greek thought. And here are some, maybe you'll recognize some of these fonts. They're designed by calligraphers, and calligraphers still do design them. And this is what my table looks like after a marathon calligraphy session. And the story here is that the editors of this Christian journal called Weavings saw the St. John's Bible. They saw an exhibition of the St. John's Bible, and they decided they wanted their journal to look just like it. So they had us, instead of just scribing a prayer here and there and maybe a cover, we had to do all the call-outs and all the poetry and illuminations and everything. So we were a two-person team that did all this work. Now, I'd also like to just take a minute to acknowledge the shoulders I stand on, and these movements are very important to me. And I don't know if anybody recognizes this as William Morris, who was the father of the arts and crafts movement. And he's often overlooked, though he's really enjoying a revival right now, and not only because his designs have come into the public sphere. I think that's probably because of his reaction to the Industrial Revolution. And I think in many ways we are reacting as well to the technical revolution that we're all involved in. And he was really an important person. He was one of the first environmentalists. He was very conscious of women and their role in the arts. So he did a lot way ahead of his time. And his movement spread from the UK to North America and Europe. And he upheld the value and dignity of craftsmanship and human creativity. And he wanted all people to have access to well-designed, good things, not shoddy merchandise. He was also pivotal in the revival of the italic hand, which is the hand of the Italian humanists, and the one I learned when I was 12 years old. Many may know him for the beautiful wallpaper and furnishings he designed, but he also created over 100 illuminated manuscript pages, beautiful books where he enlisted the talent of colleagues such as Edward Burne-Jones. In this movement, many artists worked with one another as in the medieval fashion of guilds, where for the production of a book, for example, would involve the talent of many artisans, a parchmenter, a bookbinder, an illuminator, a calligrapher, people all working together to realize a project. And what is so wonderful is this outlook still informs our lettering societies today. Now, these are, I forgot I put these in. These are two very derivative pieces I did, just being so inspired by William Morris in a trip to Kelmscott, his home in Oxford. And the other one, which is Beauty, which I can't read. I don't know if any of you can read it, but I think it pretty much sums up how I feel about the arts. And next is the father of modern calligraphy, which is Edward Johnston. And he's holding a quill there, as most medieval scribes would write on an inclined surface, which actually somebody was asking me earlier, why is that? And that is to control the flow of ink out of your tool. But that was all a prop and set up for this photo shoot. The actual quills don't look like that. We remove all the feathery parts and you just use the skeletal part itself. And I have some up here I hope you can look at. Now, he was a very special man and he followed Morris, though specialized in calligraphy and illumination only. And for his studies, he had William Morris's secretary help him find the best manuscripts in the British Library and Museum to study. He essentially rediscovered the means and methods used by ancient and medieval scribes, thereby kickstarting a revival of these arts. And his international students spread the word, and since then, calligraphy and lettering are still flourishing and connected more than ever. Serving the words and choosing fit scripts that expressed what was being written was very, very important to him. And he lived very humbly so as to do the work he wanted to do. He was a very deeply spiritual man responsible for the British arts and crafts revival to a large degree. And that's me mucking around with Edward Johnson and just studying him. And I don't know if you can read this. It's a benediction he wrote for a friend of his, which I found very, very moving. And it's, I'm going to have to go up there. The peace of God. Let me just read this. Peace of God, which passeth all understanding, be with you always. And I felt like I very much related to that because there's so much I don't understand. But I feel a peace at knowing I don't need to understand everything. And the other person I'd like to single out is my great uncle, who is really probably the reason I'm here. And he was of Greek descent, and he was trained in Greece and in Paris, initially in iconography and sculpture and letter cutting. And he brushed shoulders there in Paris with the art greats and the movements of the day. But coming back to Greece, he was tasked with becoming a war artist during the Asia Minor Wars of 1919 to 1922. In an era of judgment on the part of the Greek government, all of his work that was done during this time was lost when they were moving all his works from Athens to Izmir, which is Smyrna in Turkey. The train was attacked and all his work was lost. I should just mention here that all of these images were made at I'll get into this, at the monastery of Mount Athos, the monasteries of Mount Athos. He sought refuge after this at the religious, monastic, and self-governed community of Mount Athos in northern Greece. He stayed there with another friend for a year, painting, studying icons, manuscripts, and church vestments, and absorbing the holiness of this very special place. I wouldn't know, although I'd love to, because I've tried to follow in his footsteps because they don't allow women there. But these are just a few other of his pieces. The one on the right is the design for a church. So he was given the task of decorating a whole church, illuminating a church. So what I did is I traveled to the World Heritage Site of Meteora in northern Greece to kind of replicate or try to replicate what he experienced in this really incredible place. And they do allow women there. So what was fascinating about this is while I was living in Greece, I lived with his daughter and listened to stories about him and his artistic and spiritual experiences at Athos that transformed him and his work. He was a deeply spiritual man, exploring not only Greek religion, but Greek philosophy and ancient religions, as well as the Orthodox Christian world he lived in. And one of his studies involved the ancient tetrachrome palette, which I mentioned, which is something I'm learning about and which I teach now. And interestingly, with a group of other artists, architects, poets, and civilians, he created a journal of the arts called The Third Eye, attesting his wide-ranging spiritual concerns. This is a place he found peace and healing. Some of the images I saw at Meteora really just stopped me in my tracks, and this is one of them. And it was at the entrance to a church, and it's a whole line of icons of pre-Christian thinkers. There's Pythagoras and Homer and Justinian and all sorts of Plutarch. And I thought it was really interesting that they'd included this in their iconography. Now, as I researched the evolution of Greek alphabet and writing, I kept being drawn back to look at the lineage of shoulders supporting this innovation. And this answered some questions and posed more, which led to even more digging in older industrial and dustier marks. It's a really rich, storied, and magical field, and it enriched my appreciation for this important human invention, and it prompted me to find affinities rather than differences and to feel a kinship with others across space and time. Now, this joyful inscription predates my original subject matter by about a millennium, being scratched into stone about 4,000 years ago. The people who drew these were already standing on the shoulders of those before them, the Egyptians and their three systems of writing, hieroglyphic, hieratic, and demotic, and the Mesopotamians with the cuneiform writing. Through travel, trade, and the magical process of abstraction, pictures of things were given more new meanings and use. Early pictures describe natural phenomena, animals, human-made structures, humans, and parts of humans. For example, the human eye becomes our letter O. And the hand or the palm becomes our letter K. This here is the earliest phonetic alphabetic writing as far as we know, and most of the 24 Greek letters and the 26 Latin letters trace their DNA to this. The Latin letters springing from the Greek. And though they look like a line of ancient emojis, they're actually a little more sophisticated and come from a place called Wadi el Hol on the west bank of the Nile in Egypt. And you can discern human figures, sort of one running off to the left there, and one with hands upraised in jubilation. And I want to pay attention to that one. So his hands are up like this. You can see this either in prayer or a gesture of thanks. And there's a lovely smiling ox head off to the left. And at the very far left, you'll see what looks like a DNA helix, but it's actually probably a bound cord of linen. Though, and how this works is that they aren't pictures of things as you'd expect. Rather, each one of them represents a specific sound value. So, for example, if I have a picture of a bee and a picture of a leaf, I put those together, I have the word belief. So this is really the most important thing in the evolution of our letters and our language. Though this innovation wasn't exactly a new thing, this is when the idea took off. And from then until now, we use a set of mutually agreed upon signs to represent the sounds of the languages we speak. This image represents a transitional process when those drawings still retained a semblance of what they were originally meant to represent. You could argue, and the early Greeks did, that writing is only a semblance of speech, a pale version of the more important sounds that we make. And when I was reading about this, I thought, well, this sounds very familiar. It sounds like the mistrust I have of every new technology I have to learn. So this is how this works. You can see on the bottom left-hand corner, there's an image of a bird. And over time, that image gets flipped. So it's not immediately recognizable. And then it becomes abstracted. So it doesn't look like a picture at all anymore. And this is probably the most important thing that happened for our history of writing. So this is really, writing is a system of human communication that works through the use of visible signs. This is how the beginnings of writing are inseparably connected to those of art, and one must never treat them as separate entities. And I remember my teacher telling me that writing is a specialized form of drawing, and I never quite understood that till I realized this is what he was talking about. And this from my high school art teacher, who filled my adolescent head with all sorts of wisdoms I could not apprehend, such as, look at the mark you aren't making. Look at the trees and look at the spaces between the branches. Look to nature. Our letters are in nature. And this is how this works. So if you look at that smiling ox head and you look at how we go from the Egyptian to Phoenician, Roman, Greek, and you can see that we end up with the letter A. So our letter A originated from the little ox head. And likewise, our lovely, jubilant person, hands upraised, becomes our letter E. And you can see how all of a sudden that hand with the little head gets inverted to its side. But you'll never see E the same way after this. I always see it as this person, with hands upraised, which is very special. And over to the right, you can see that zigzag that actually represents water. And you can see how that ends, we end up with the letter M at the very end. I have this chart out here, so if anybody has time afterwards, we can look at those. And that is shows all the letters of the alphabet and how they evolved, or most of them. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because I only have an hour, but the conventional accepted theory of how this happened and who made those marks is that they were a group of itinerant workers in Egypt who spoke a Semitic language. And they looked around at the marks the Egyptians were making and went, oh, well, that's really interesting. I think we can simplify this so that we can all understand things. And that's how we have this. Now, the one thing I should say is the Phoenicians adopted it for their language and through travel and trade introduced it to the Greeks. And then they introduced it to the Italians via colonization. And Greek went on to become the basis for several other scripts, Latin, Cyrillic, Coptic, Glagolitic, Gothic, Armenian, and to some extent Runic and Berber. Now, we're looking at, on the left, a piece of Phoenician writing, and on the right, a piece of early Greek writing. And you can see how similar they are and kind of twiggy and very natural looking. And you'll notice that some letters go in one direction and the next line they go in another. And that's because writing at the time was not standardized. Initially, the Phoenicians were writing from, let's see, right to left and left to right. So the opposite of what we do now. And there was an intermediary step called bastrophodon, which means as the ox plows. So you would read from right to left and then left to right on the following line and right to left and left to right, this sort of long winding page. was eventually standardized by the Greeks to the way we read now, which is from left to right. Okay. Now you can see, I won't dwell on this too long, but I just want to hit home that there were many, many regional varieties. And the one that was transmitted to Italy, I'm going to go back here, right over here, was the West Greek or Ebian. And interestingly, one of the reasons people complain that English doesn't have enough vowels, it's because this was transmitted to the Italians, Romans, before the Greeks added more vowels to their alphabet. So the scripts were standardized in 403. I'll go back here. So we have 24 letters and 26 in the Latin. Okay. Now, the following images are just a nod to a holistic appraisal of the arts, including architecture. And there are many compelling aesthetic parallels, and our preferences even seem cyclical, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. And this is the first time I'd ever seen letters and architecture side by side, and I was really taken aback at how similar the writing looks. And what is so fascinating is you notice at the very top is an early Greek building with early Greek writing. And the special thing about this is there's absolutely nothing extraneous in these letter forms. There's no special special serifs, special little feet or anything. It's a very minimalist alphabet. And if you look down at the last one, the ho at the very bottom right, you'll notice we return to that. And there's a very good reason for that, because designers, letter designers, were looking at these ancient scripts, trying to find some kind of lettering that expressed their sense of minimalism and modernity. So we've cycled right back to the original minimalists. And I don't know if you have preferences for sans serif or serif scripts, but the sans serif would harken back to ancient Greece. Now, there's an image here. I just wanted to bring this up because this happened in the arts as well. When all these antiquities were coming to the fore, artists and designers were looking at these things. There's two sculptures there. They come from the Cyclades, and they're about 3,000 to 1,000 BC. And you can see how Pablo Picasso and on the right, Constantin Brancusi were influenced by these. So not just the letters, but our art changed radically by looking back at things. Now, I wanted to call attention to the work of Genevieve von Petzinger, and she's a paleoanthropologist at UVic. And her name came up at one of our coffee chats at the center and reminded me of the important work she's doing in researching the very first graphic communication of people who had absolutely no other shoulders to stand on, as far as we know. She created a database of Ice Age signs from about 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, spanning about 370 sites in Europe. And most of these sites are in caves in the belly of the earth. I don't know how she did it to go into these scary places, but she's created a database of 32 geometric marks, which reflect the development of the modern human mind, of cognitive evolution, of symbolic behavior, and of the imagination. And I think that's what's so important. So I wonder, were these considered sacred, and just what might that have meant to those who made them? If these are sacred, or the act of making them was, can we find a thread of continuity in subsequent writing systems and in our own? Did the physical act of writing have a spirituality about it that we've perhaps lost? Well, I'd like to say rather boldly that I think calligraphers come very close to that because we actually slow down and absorb all of this and do it slowly and intentionally. And I think the feeling we get and the sense of, more than anything, the sense of time, which changes when we're working, might just kind of bring us back to what these early people might have felt making these marks. She also poses a really important question, and that is there a common origin for our writing systems? And I think this is quite a fascinating chart here, which would seem to indicate there was. Now, most global writing systems have a divine origin story that speaks to the value and esteem in which they were held. And it seems fair to say that great power was attached to writing, and it was often considered a gift from the gods. In ancient Greece, that god was Apollo, an important figure not only in the classical world, but in the early Christian world, as he often stood in for Jesus before he could actually be represented openly, before Christianity was tolerated. And there was specific reasons for that. Characters like Apollo and Orpheus were used by early Christians because they represented something of the qualities that they felt Jesus had. So it also seems fair to me to say that writing systems could serve both the sacred and the profane. The same writing could transcribe laws, religious and philosophical texts, blessings, curses, or advertisements. There was no sacred style of writing like hieroglyphs. The meaning of hieroglyphs is sacred marks, and it was actually the Greeks who coined that phrase when they saw these beautiful Egyptian hieroglyphs. But we're accustomed, I think, to this kind of duality because we can read a biblical text in Helvetica, which is sans serif, perhaps just as well as in Times New Roman, though I know people have very strong opinions on these matters. Some cultures had styles for each and others didn't, but that doesn't mean that whatever meaning was once attached was entirely lost. It didn't take long before each of these marks was invested with new meaning and symbolism. So a piece that I made that's on display here reflects some of the Greek origin stories about writing. And one is that humans learned to write from observing bird tracks. And another that some of the Greek letters come from observing the flight patterns of cranes. These facts are the facts are a little more complicated, but I really see that there's a little bit of truth in this. And if you look at Genevieve's geometric marks, that reminds us that that could be the case. And several of those marks actually look like our letters today. They're especially at the bottom of the Y. I think it very poetic and it links our marks to nature. Now, the Greeks related their 7 vowels to the 7 heavenly bodies and the 7 strings of Apollo's lyre, which brought harmony to existence. 7 was a really significant number in Pythagorean and other mystical thought, and the 7 vowels gained a lot of associations because of this. Consonants were thought to give words their bodies, while vowels put soul or spirit into them. Some, of course, not all, believed the letters to be symbolic keys to the meaning of existence. Vowels were considered especially important in unlocking the mysteries. That jubilant E becomes a very important letter in Pythagorean mysticism. Plutarch mentions that an E was inscribed over the famous Oracle of Delphi, which is near my mother's hometown. Because it had 5 points and was the 5th letter, it was considered equal to 5 and thought of as the letter of light. E became associated with the Pythagorean way, which was balance and justice. Now, writing was not just used for utilitarian purposes, and it's really unfair that our writing is being characterized this way. It was aligned with poetry and music from the get-go. In short, with all the arts, which were inherently linked to the divine. Poetry inscribed on ceramic vessels, for example. The one on the left says, "I am the cup of Nestor," which suggests that early writing took on a life of its own. It had a power. It not only identifies the owner, but attempts to transcribe the sonority of the human voice. And you can see on the side, this is a flute player and a dancer. And they've actually represented the dancers in sequence, and the letters are kind of running all over around. I think that requires a little bit of imagination, and especially on the part of the artist who's trying to simulate what was going on, simulate the movement and the sounds. And we also have writing linked to the cycle of life and religious beliefs surrounding the afterlife. And this is, these are Orphic tablets. They're called tablets. They were actually little talismans that would be rolled up and worn around the neck. You can see the young boy on the right. He's actually wearing one of these tablets rolled up in that little amulet around his neck. And Orpheus is also very important. He was used by early Christians to represent something of Christ as well. I think the taming of the beasts, the playing of music, which had the ability to transform people. And similar talismans and amulets are still a part of popular culture in the Mediterranean and the Near East. And it just strikes me that we enlist as much support as possible to keep out of harm's way. This is a commission I did, which is an Orphic prayer. And I initially wanted to do it in gold and inscribe the letters just as the tablets were. And I told the classics professor who commissioned me that the letters should be written in capital letters. And he said, "Well, that's not how I learned Greek." You learn Greek using the minuscule or lowercase letters. So he said, "I want it to have a feeling of the way I learned Greek." So now we're just going to speak about essential forms and geometry and its impact on the arts, which cannot be understated. It's both practical and sacred. Forms and writing styles evolved very slowly, increasingly being framed in terms of three simple geometric shapes, which were known to have symbolic significance through the study and practice of sacred geometry. Though they served as useful shape templates for organizing the visual information contained in letter forms, but they also had a transcendent quality and meaning. And I think the whole notion of organizing things in grids, again, it's a very human inclination to have templates for our thinking and for our writing. But the grid and the net also had symbolic significance in the Egyptian world. And here you can see Egyptian and Greek, Greco-Roman, and on the left, on the right, you have cuneiform writing. You can see they're horizontally aligned and vertically aligned. Just a word here, this writing often gets characterized as boring and simple and all of that. But I think once you look at it, and I don't know if you can read, I'm just going to scoot up here for a minute. That which is good or beautiful has a certain order inside. And that's expressed in the Poetics of Aristotle, book 35, chapter 7. And the minute you understand that, all of a sudden, this rather simple writing that looks like it could have been generated on a typewriter takes on a new meaning. It's about finding order in the world. And the other thing that's very important is the letters are very simple, but that's the genius of the thing, because if they weren't simple, it would have been a lot harder for literacy and democratization of writing. So these proportions, there are several names. We have the golden rectangle, the golden ratio, the divine proportion, and later the Fibonacci sequence. And the latter expresses numerically the patterns found in nature. Now, this phenomenon can prompt wonder at the marvelous nature of creation and in nature. Oh, wonderful. Sorry, the marvelous nature of creation. And it certainly did for me as a child. And I hold those experiences as very precious. Um, I'm going to just confess something. I have dyscalculia, which means almost an inability to do anything beyond simple math. So I'm probably the last person to speak about geometry, but I did have those experiences as a child where I would look at something and notice that there's a pattern and an order to it. It was very special. Or you'd look at a leaf and look at your hand and realize these are almost the same marks. And to me, that experience of childhood is really a truth. It's a truth I hold very dear. And even though I can't understand all of this, I think we can understand it intuitively. When we look around us, you look at the trees, look at the shapes between the spaces between the branches. I think we can absorb this intuitively, and artists do. And I included this slide here of a little device you can buy now and hold up, and it gives you that beautiful proportion. That proportion is repeated in nature, in our bodies, in everything we make, in book pages, in the size of your credit card, all over the place. Why is it appealing? It just is. If you take a piece of paper and split it in half, it's not as interesting if you split it almost 3/4, 1/4. And I would just like to read something from one of the greatest poets of childhood. I don't know if you've heard of Thomas Traherne. Then was my soul my only all to me, a living endless eye, just bounded by the sky, whose power, whose act, whose essence was to see. I must become a child again. Now, the universe, just backtrack, sorry. Do you mind if I just stop and have a bit of water? Sacred geometry is a way of understanding the origins of the universe, the blueprint of creation, and the genesis of all form, from molecules of DNA to snowflakes, to crystals, flower petals, shells, the galaxy we spiral in, and even, as recent research shows, the growth habits of forests. Letter forms, books, architecture, and even economics. The universe appears to be a masterpiece of geometric symmetry and order, and it informs everything we design, from letter forms, books, architecture. For example, the Parthenon uses these proportions, music, poetry, and it's said that God arithmetizes. We can design with it, with or without symbolism attached to it. And some thinking is that these proportions were over-applied, for example, in the Renaissance. And I've included the letter form B there, designed by a Renaissance artist. Lettering artists don't work this way. They're not engineers. We have an intuitive appreciation of these proportions, and we don't draw letters mechanically. This was overstated in the Renaissance, and I'll just point out that Renaissance scholars were looking to find ancient writing to emulate, and they made a little mistake. They thought they were looking at manuscripts written in the 9th century during the time of Charlemagne. They thought they were ancient Greek and ancient Roman texts. So writing would look a lot different if they hadn't made that mistake. Now, I'm going to single out this particular inscription because it includes something very special. We looked at the early letters, had absolutely no extraneous elements. And I just want to point out, I don't know if you can see at the very bottom, some of the letters show a very distinct wedge shape at the end of the letters, what we'd call a proto-serif or a serif, a little foot at the end of all the letter stems. Well, this is a very unusual thing that happens, and it happens at the time of Alexander the Great. We know he was running around conquering the world, and he had just conquered the Persian king Darius. And what happened to the letters after this is very interesting. And I can't prove this entirely, but I do believe this is the case, and there's some scholars backing me up on this. I think what Alexander did is, as a nod to Persian culture, which we know he esteemed very greatly, he took the cuneiform wedge and he added it to the end of all the letter forms. And that's called the proto-serif. And what's so interesting, can everybody see the little wedges? You can see here what happens to the letters. They don't look the same at all. They look quite thorny. And I don't believe this is arbitrary. I don't believe this was a stylistic device at all. And what's so fascinating is that this gesture on the part of Alexander changed our letter forms forever, because you can see that this writing on the right comes from the holy site of Dion in northern Greece. And it's a Latin inscription. And look at the little wedges at the end of it. It's quite fascinating. And that has remained part of our writing, the way our letters look up till now. And just a quick write here on writing. With the adoption of Christianity by Constantine the Great, there are more slow changes to writing. I think the choice of Greek as a lingua franca of this new empire was not arbitrary at all, but politically driven. Greeks did not persecute Jesus, unlike Romans. So I think the adoption of Greek scripts and the Greek uncial script in particular to write many of the earliest manuscripts, biblical manuscripts, was both practical and political. Now, as I was researching all of this and keen to find, more instances of the power which was attached to writing, I came across this wonderful mosaic floor at the Byzantine Museum in Thessaloniki, Greece. And as you walk into the room, you walk into the house, there's a blessing written for every member of the household on the floor. And I just thought, wow, was this part of a ritual? Was it part of, I've never seen anything like this before. And then I saw an image of these shoes, and on the bottom of the shoes were inscribed all these wonderful blessings for health and wellness. And nobody would have seen them. They would have hit the ground. But I believe that writing at the time had the power to create change in the world, to bring these things about. And here's another example for blessings and a propensity for sort of protective spells, not unlike the ancient world. There's no surprise on this one that health is first, and the wreath which encloses the words is also symbolic. Wreaths were also given to victors, and each had a symbolism based on the foliage used to make it. Writing that has effect in the world, and writing meant to protect. I've kind of gotten carried away with this. And it's my very favorite thing to do is to write beautiful things like this. And it gives me a sense that I'm writing it not just for myself, but imparting that positive goodwill out into the world. Now, numbers also had special significance, and letters were attached to numbers given numerical value. I hesitated to include this middle one, but I've included it as a sort of form of scribal voodoo, I would call it. They are curse tablets. And the one thing that again stopped me in tracks was one of the lead tablets I saw at an exhibition in Athens. And the object of the person being cursed, his name was Mino. His name was actually written upside down. And that was intended to turn his life upside down, to turn him upside down and create a turbulence in his life. And I thought, well, I don't want to go anywhere near this stuff, but it's another indication that, you know, people took this seriously and believed in the efficacy of words to change the world. And here's another instance where writing is absolutely not utilitarian. And this harkens back to a group of Hellenistic poets in the 3rd century BC. And what they did is they wrote poems about things in the shape of those things. So a poem about an egg in the shape of an egg. And here we have a poem about an axe in the shape of an axe. And what's important here is all of this artistry was preserved for us in the Renaissance. So it was passed on. And we see in the Christian period, for example, we have texts written in the shape of crosses, usually as colophons. And here, for example, is another one of Simmias's poems about wings. And there you see George Herbert's poem. So this is a continuity of a tradition that began in 300 BC. And here we are again. There's Lewis Carroll. And this is me in the center. And during the pandemic, this is about all I could come up with was drawing hourglasses. And yeah, it was a difficult time. And the work of Meg Chapman, which isn't calligraphy, but it's type. And what's important about that particular shape is it represents the intersection of 2 circles. And that is a very sacred shape called the mandorla or the vesica piscis. And you'll often see Jesus or the Virgin Mary represented in this shape. And the other interesting thing at this time is how people got very creative with letters. And I can understand these early inscriptions. Has anybody heard of the Sator Arapo? Yeah, it was often used by early Christians before Christianity was tolerated. And that was as a protective thing, but also to show that you were a Christian because other Christians knew the code. And this became very important again in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, where you have, I would say, sort of meditative calligraphy, praying with a pen. And again, we have continuity to the present. Now, the other thing that we consider very modern nowadays is text in art. Well, it's not modern at all. It goes back right to the very beginnings. And I really enjoyed juxtaposing these images because one of them is a Greek scholar in an Egyptian world. And the other is from the St. John's Bible, and it represents Paul. And I think at the far right, upper right, you can actually see the monastery in Minnesota. And you can also see that the proportions have changed a little bit. And Paul is a little longer. And this is not arbitrary at all. In the early Christian period, I think they wanted to distinguish themselves from the pagan, the pre-Christian world before them. So what they did is they altered the proportions of the body and of writing to indicate that something different is going on here. We're not looking at the real world. We're looking at a different, at a supernatural world, a spiritual world. And here you have text in art again, very modern. Now, I'm just going to finish up with a couple of really interesting writing styles. And you'll notice on the left, at the very top, you see this very strange long writing. And there's very, very little scholarship about all of this. The closest thing I've come is that they're called kerea. This type of writing is called kerea, which means antennae or lightning. And the idea here is that the word of God comes down and is transmitted to the emperor, the empress, who's representing the divine, and it's garbled. It's not legible for the average human being. And then the emperor and the empress make that legible in a more legible style of writing. So it's a way of trying to show that what comes from God goes through first this channel and then is given to the people. And I think that's really quite an interesting idea. And you can see on the very bottom, this is the top of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So they're continuing this tradition of sort of illegible writing. And we can see this in the West, in the charter hands. They all kind of look like they're reaching upwards. And I don't think that's arbitrary at all. And you can see how it starts, with the letters getting a little longer to emulate, to kind of be compatible with the iconography. You think about El Greco and those really long proportions. So again, the lettering is according with the art and the architecture. But what happens is as the Byzantine Empire disintegrates, all of these ideas are transmitted to Bulgaria, to Ukraine, to Russia, and they become a thing and they become even more stylized and more evolved. And this type of writing in Russia and Ukraine is called vias, to tie or to bind. And I think it's enjoying a huge revival now, especially amongst young people. And I think it's because you can take a text or you can take anything that you're writing or thinking and write it in this very cryptic kind of style. And it requires a very meditative frame of mind to do so. And because we have a completely broken tradition and no books about Greek writing and Greek calligraphy, I'm trying to piece together this stuff and figure it all out so I can teach it. There's an example here of Kedea writing and also of a calligram. The large piece on the left is from the Song of Solomon or Song of Songs, set me as a seal upon your arm, and it's shaped in the shape of a seal, as well as using this writing style. And I'll just finish up here with another particularly bizarre and very non-utilitarian type of writing. We don't know what it is. Somebody has given it the name monocondylic, which means sort of one thumb. In other words, you use one stroke to make all these letters. You try not to lift the pen off the page very much. And I know a scholar, calligrapher friend of mine would call that scribal ebullience. This appears at the end of a mathematical treatise. So I have no idea what it's doing there. But I think it might be linked to just the joy of finishing a book, but also this predilection towards having, cryptic signatures. And there's probably some good reasons for this. For example, now we have such concerns with thievery, and watermarks on our images and all of this. So I think these complicated doodles are a way of making it very difficult to forge things, but also just to express oneself. And you can see probably, here as monograms is probably our first form of branding and probably the most important one I know of, the Hero monogram, and that's from the Lindisfarne Gospels. And those early Irish scribes used Greek letters often to give, I think, their writing and their spirituality and their beliefs a historical grounding. And I just want to finish up, sum up, I think, how I feel about what I do. And this is from a plaque that's on the outside of my great uncle's home in our village. And it's one of his quotes, which is, "Nature is the miracle of God, and art is the miracle of mankind." And I've got that piece right here. And I used one of his own pieces as inspiration for the colors. And, oh, that's it. Thank you very much. I'm showing the jubilant man, hands upraised in praise. Thank you. I had some other slides here of work that's being done by friends of mine in the Ukraine at the moment, but I know people you wanted to give me time. Oh, no, it's okay. I just thought, in case anybody asked me what's going on in the world of calligraphy today, well, there's a Polish calligrapher who designed this rather remarkable image here, which is kind of going around the world. And I think she's used the Hiroshima design a little bit, but it doesn't matter. She's created something stunning. And then these are friends of mine, a Ukrainian girl named Victoria. And to the war effort, they had been donated this helicopter to go in to do rescue missions. And she decided to do calligraphy on the exterior, acknowledging all the donors who had contributed to this. And apologies, which I really wish the Canadian government had given us a chance to do some really good ones. This is the work of Gemma Black, an Australian calligrapher, and her apologies to the Indigenous peoples, and the work of Andrew Vandermeer in South Africa. And Bryony Penn, I don't know if anybody knows Bryony Penn, some of the absolutely beautiful mandalas she's doing, which really show an incredibly deep appreciation of nature and how everything is connected. And I'll just finish with this, some beach calligraphy. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgia. So I will open up the floor now to any questions that anybody might have for Georgia. It's hard to hear. It might be better just to come up and ask it. It is quite hard to hear in here.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have a quick announcement and then a quick question for you. The announcement is just the St. John's Bible is mentioned a few times, and I know there is one of the 299 copies in Victoria, but just in case people here can't make the trip to Victoria, Regent College acquired one pretty recently. And they have one volume always on display in the library, but through the library's website, you can book one-on-one time with a librarian to look at it. So thought I'd mention that. My question for you, one of the threads that I loved in your presentation was the connection between nature, the rhythms of nature and the forms of nature and our own writing. And it struck me as I was looking at your writing that you deal with words. And I deal with words. I'm a student. I'm trying to be a clergy. I know there's a lot of people who do have a lot of words, words upon words upon words. And you're going slower. But I wonder what advice you'd have for those of us who are constantly typing or reading or working with words, as someone who's learned to slowly work with words.
I think just the procedure I follow, for example, when I'm given something to write, I really savor that piece of writing. I go over it, I tear it apart, I try to find the internal structure of the writing and the meaning. And the more I actually just write it out, it doesn't have to be in anything fancy. It almost comes to me the best sort of the fit script to express that. It would be like choosing, not choosing Comic Sans, but choosing something else, so, and I've got these hands in my hand, but I would just say even writing, just sitting down and writing a text or a passage allows you to really get into the words. And I think this is what I love most about what I do. And I'm happiest when I can just write passages that I'm interested in understanding, like that Johnston passage, which was a simple benediction, but so deep and profound. And I think it impacts the way I understand writing and gives it a space in my heart as well as my mind by taking the time just to even write it out with a pencil slowly, without haste, or make haste slowly, I should say. It makes a difference. And I will often there's some pieces of poetry I'm trying to write. One of my favorite authors is Kathleen Raine, because I love the way everything in life is sacred to her. All of nature is sacred. Every living being is sacred. And there's one of her poems I just can't get right. I can't hit it. And I called a poet friend of mine. I said, why am I not getting this? And he goes, well, you haven't understood the poem properly. It's about the imagination. It's not about just nature and leaves. And once I understood that, I sat down and it came out the right way, so there was an impediment in my understanding that showed in my confusion on the page. So I think sometimes just slowing down and writing things out. And I know people are not writing as much with pencil and paper, but even writing on a tablet is different than this. We're doing very different things. And I think psychologists have shown us and given us enough evidence to prove that we do retain more and we internalize more. So that would probably be the best way to answer that. It doesn't have to be fancy calligraphy. As a matter of fact, that could be very frustrating for a beginner. Just, are there any other questions?
I would like to point out too, for those online viewers, that if you have any questions, you can submit them and they will be read out.
Okay.
I just have a question about, do you have any thoughts on graffiti and tagging? Lettering or expression. I have taught in multiple school doing this all the time, and then the book and the
Yeah, well, I tend to be, there's a lot of calligraphers I know that frown upon graffiti, and they will not sort of let it come into the calligraphic world. They'll put a little wall around us. I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should embrace as much lettering that's being done in a direct way as possible. And I think one of the things I enjoy most is when I teach abroad, I get a lot of graffiti artists. They just really want to do better writing. And I think in a way they're able to reach people more than I can in my sort of limited scope. And I remember when I was in Greece, one of the most visible, recognizable pieces of graffiti was written by a young man who was upset because his girlfriend dumped him. And he went and he wrote, Vasanizome, very simple, which means I'm struggling, I'm suffering. And all of Greece seemed to embrace this because everybody on some level was struggling with something. And that one word, that one verb touched more people than I think I could touch with anything I do, even if I gilded it. And yeah, it was really a remarkable, remarkable thing. And then he comes for calligraphy classes because he wants to improve his style. And I'm thinking, yes, this is exactly what we need, because calligraphy is often considered, something your grandma used to do. Well, it's not the case. It's an important cultural activity. And actually, it's, especially during the pandemic, it became a big thing. And calligraphy does take a long time to learn, but it is accessible. And I think it's a really healthy, sane way of slowing down our world. One of the issues I have with dyscalculia and slight dyslexia is I will just write passages over and over again slowly, just to slow the world down. And when I'm doing that, I'm in a different space. My experience of time and place changes. And that's really close to a spiritual experience for me. Thank you. Yes?
Two comments, which I'll preface just, my appreciation for you sharing your work. I teach biblical study, and I had my students do this past semester. And this is really to your point about slowing down.
Yeah.
And writing. And I had a commonplace book, which is a medieval practice. It's sort of an aid for reading, where they write out in longhand a passage from scripture that was interesting to them or that they wanted to return to, and then they annotated below that. The idea that, I think you're exactly right to emphasize this point that we need to slow down in order to deeply engage, scripture or text at an emotional level and sort of have a contemplation or sometimes. And my other comment was about Arabic, because the focus on the beauty of the language. I read a lot of commonplace books from my students where the writing sounds so good. It really is beautiful, like your writing is beautiful. But it led me to think about other religions and how, a script like in Hebrew scripts or, the scribal art, or in Arabic, I think, where it is sort of like some of the images that you had, you can't even read it. It's really about the beauty of the flowing letters. It's not intended to be read in a straightforward manner. And that's what some of those slides that you had reminded me of. The ones where you said they don't pick up the pen, or they're sort of stretched out.
Oh, yeah.
Revelation, or they're expressing something else by the shape that they're written in with the margins,
Yeah.
So that was just, they're really just comments, that, but I don't know, what do you feel like that?
I think that's all to the good. I think slowing down is really important because I just feel we're so hell-bent on acquiring knowledge, acquiring information, but we're not. We are and we're not. I think when you slow down, especially with biblical writings, spiritual writings, you're also getting in the right mindset to receive. One of the pieces I put up, I didn't talk about, but I was in that place just writing this beautiful Khalil Gibran quote. And I didn't realize till I stepped away from my work that the page was actually an image of a dragonfly. I had created this without even realizing it because I'd put the time and the energy and the effort and didn't let anything distract me. And it's almost like this appeared on the page without my willing it because I was in that state. And I'm embarrassed to say it, I won't admit this, but I really feel something special happened there because my hand wasn't in it. And I know there's a Greek term, achiropita, made without hands. And just something special happens, when you're not in complete control and you've given yourself over to something. I know that may sound outlandish, maybe crazy, but it happened. It's on the page, It was one of those things I showed, the second slide I showed. So for me, these are gifts, and I appreciate that not everybody has the time and, to slow down like this, but I think it's an antidote to what we have going around us and going on constantly within our heads and in our environment, you know. Yes.
Hands in your hand, which of course is how you interpret text. And what do you say us who perhaps have content, like the italics or like, because I do a journal every day and I need to get text of it.
Yeah.
And the sort of tips that you give us on how to really have one or two hands, how we can express our own interpretation.
Absolutely. I wish I'd brought a picture with me where I'm making notes on a text I'm working on, and I'm going through all the words and everything that is evoked. It's soft. It feels like this. It's gentle. It's round. It's not dynamic. It's not diagonal. It doesn't have that feeling. It doesn't have an edginess. So I think that is paying attention to the words, letting them live in you for a little while, especially if they're meaningful and important. And I think the italic hand in particular is patient of so much interpretation. You can make italic look very joyful. You can make it look very edgy. You can give almost any script a certain look just by the way you write it. So I think even if you know one or two basic scripts or your handwriting, you can infuse it with a quality of emotion. Like if I'm writing the word lullaby, I'm not going to write that in an, this edgy Trump type signature. I'm going to write it in something gentle, which evokes that word. And I think a lot of calligraphers I know also love etymology and words and get right into them. I can sit and just write. As a matter of fact, I took a course in Belgium with a calligrapher I love, and we wrote one word for the whole week. It was a meditative, completely meditative. And the word, was supposed to be something very special to us, something meaningful. I chose 2 words, but he let me do that. But the exercise is more, it's less about writing and calligraphy than it is about an experience that's out of the everyday. That's really important. It's not your run of the mill everyday experience. You're coming out of the world a little bit, a kind of standing apart from. And yeah, I think it's very important because it replenishes us internally. Yes. Right. Okay. Islamic calligraphy. I just want to grab something from here. The Quran writing that I showed you earlier, I believe, may have evolved during those periods of iconoclasm in Byzantine history, where representations of holy personages was discouraged because of the association with idols. And I believe they were looking at, for example, Islamic writing. And I think if you look at this, Islamic writing is also, it's a spiritual activity with a material instrument. The sacred geometry is all over the place. And I think if you look at this, you're going to see something of that Byzantine writing. And I think that's just cross-cultural interaction and influence. But there's something behind it. And I think, I don't know yet, but I think it might have emerged during these periods of iconoclasm where representing people and holy personages was not allowed. And they looked to the Islamic world, which already had that in place, and created writing systems that express something. And about calligraphy, it's a relatively new term, and essentially it just means beautiful writing. So that can be your everyday writing. I think what they mean is that it's specialized. And I mean, you could say, for example, handwriting that your grandmother might have done looks like calligraphy today. Because it's not printing, it tends to be cursive and connected. But that doesn't define all calligraphy, doesn't have to look like that. It doesn't have to be connected. It just means it's a specialized form of writing that takes some time to acquire. But I think nowadays, when handwriting's not really even taught much, any kind of writing is calligraphy almost. So, yeah. Oh. Okay.
Hi, fantastic talk. Thank you so much. As you were talking about various traditions of sacred writing that sort of evolved from Greek writing, I thought so much about the parallels with sacred Hebrew calligraphy, right? The sacred serifs or crowns on the letters, the mystical meaning of the letter shapes, the importance of amulets. And I know from just 1 hour of listening to you that you're fond of saying this is not arbitrary. Do you have any thoughts on the connections? Thanks.
Well, first of all, I was hugely, we're connected to this writing system as well. I think the differences with the Greek is because we were conquered and we had 400 years of essentially cessation of culture, that these things were lost. And even perhaps now, when we practice the art of calligraphy, we've lost a lot of the things that Hebrew calligraphers have, this sense of the sacred. And I'm just going to illustrate this practically. Little bamboo breathing tube, which is used to activate the glue before we attach gold. And in one of my classes, I was huffing and puffing, to try and get the glue to get sticky again so that the gold would stick. And I noticed out of the corner of my eye that this lady was looking at me, and she took me aside very discreetly after my demonstration, and she said, "Georgia, in iconography, that's called the breath of God." And I thought, oh, I was terribly embarrassed, but so grateful that I had an insight into how these people felt about what they did. Because a lot of calligraphy is commercial now, and there's fewer, I think, people who are able to do the kind of work that we see in the St. John's Bible. But I think if you talk to any of them, Donald Jackson in particular, everything about what he does is done with a very deep spirituality. The way he writes, the way he prepares his gold and his pigments. And I'm trying to piece together what that might have been in this world, because we've lost that. And there's nobody that does this in Greece today. Nobody. I found a nun at Madeira, but she uses a, I'm not interested in, so I think looking to different traditions, we get an inkling of what it was like for them. Does that help? Yeah, okay, thank you. But I thought this was the breath of God, and ever since then, I can't think of it the way I used to. It's the same when I look at the letter E and I understand what that was for these people at some point in time, and how that particular letter just kept gaining more and more symbolism. And I think we just have so much coming at us today that we don't understand that world at all. There's nothing sacred in it. It's the content that's sacred rather than the way it's delivered. But I think it's really important to reconstruct all of this. And I think that using these natural materials, first of all, for me, I don't feel guilty when I dump out a little bit of my ink because it's all organic, it's not harmful. So I feel like my practice is not harming the environment. Although, not to be deceived. Natural materials are not all non-toxic. There's a lot of them that are, and a lot of artists died using, for example, white lead. But these things just take your practice to a different level when you can build that in. Yeah, well, there's an author called Richard Firmage. I can't remember the title of the book. I think it's just the 26 letters of the alphabet. And he walks through every single letter from its inception, its first use till now. And he explains all the different symbolism, But I think what's so important is that blend of utility and this spiritual, they don't have to be separated. They can be together. And I think that which is beautiful can also be very practical, And I mean, even if you look at the way leaves are patterned on a tree, they're patterned so that each one of them can receive the sun and can receive the rain. And that's beautiful, but it's also practical. It has a lovely rhythm, but it's also practical in its what would it be? In its creation. So for me, I keep going back to those childhood where we're really kind of seeing the world the way it really is before we get confused. I want to say somehow, because I do feel that those initial perceptions were truths for me that still hold true. And even though I can't understand Christianity in depth and some of the philosophies I've been studying, I can take away what is true to me and what seems real, But I hope everybody has some time to look and feel and touch and stuff.
What we'll do now is we'll end, unless anybody's got a question in the audience here now, we will end the discussion. Please feel free to come up. Georgia's put out a lot of examples here and product and tools that she's been using throughout her career. And then just across the way, just out the doors here, slightly to your right, through another set of doors, is the reception area where we have a little bit of wine and cheese and fruit for everybody to partake in as well. So please feel free to come up and
Thank you. Nice to you.